In this video, we're going to wrap up our discussion on chapter 35, I think, or the chapter on monetary policy, regardless of what number it is. All right, and in this video, we're going to be talking about the negative real shock dilemma. All right, so in the last video, the first thing we did in that video was look at the best case for monetary policy, when it's most effective, right, or when it's most likely to be effective. And that was when we had a negative shock to aggregate demand, right? So through whatever mechanism that occurs, right, whether it's a decrease in the consumption spending growth rate or the investment spending growth rate, so on and so forth, right? Now we're going to be talking about a real shock, right? So in case we don't remember, real shocks shift the long-run aggregate supply. All right. So a real shock, this is a shock that is going to fundamentally change an economy's ability to produce, right, goods and services. All right. And then we're specifically saying a negative shock because that's the only time the Fed might want to do something. If we have a positive shock, all right, if our potential growth rate increases, nobody wants to do anything about that, all right, because that's going to be a good thing, all right. But if we have a negative real shock, then the Fed may want to do something, all right. Unfortunately, all right, monetary policy is not very effective against real shocks. All right, specifically we'll say negative real shocks. All right, so we're going to have two options. All right, that's where we're going to have our dilemma, right? Choosing which one to pursue, if we're going to pursue either of them, right? But it's just not. Negative real shocks are hard to deal with. All right, we'll see when we're talking about fiscal policy. It's also not good at dealing with negative real shocks. All right, but let's kind of go ahead and get started with this. All right, so if we have, well, actually, let me just draw this up. So we're going to be drawing probably quite a few of these graphs because I'm going to have to show you a couple of them. When I do that, just like with the last one when we had the graphs, I'm probably just going to draw the graph up and then just talk about it and make any changes on the graph we need to. So it'll be important to write down not just the graph and all the changes to the graph, but also write down what's being said, right, or the important bits, which, you know, or you can just rewatch the video, right, if you don't remember. All right, but let's say, well, actually, I'm just going to draw this. If you're taking notes, leave yourself a little header. I'll label this in just a moment. So just leave yourself room for a title. All right, so we're going to start this off. All right, we're going to have our long-run aggregate supply curve knot, and then we are going to have our initial aggregate demand curve a D knot. All right, and we will save the short-run aggregate supply curve for later. All right, we'll put that in later. One, because we just don't really need it for this initial point, and it's just going to make the graph really clustered, or cluttered. That's the word I was looking for. All right, so we've got a long-run equilibrium here. We've got our equilibrium inflation rate. We've got our solo growth rate here. Now, let's introduce our negative real shock, right? So a negative real shock, that's going to be something that decreases the long-run aggregate supply. Right? You also think of it as decreasing the inflation rate, or not the inflation rate, the solo growth rate. All right, but regardless, we're going to shift this curve to the left, right? One, because we know if we're decreasing supply, we shift the curve to the left. And then also, that's the only way to decrease that solo growth rate. So let's put in our new long-run aggregate supply curve. All right, so that's our negative real shock, right? That movement of the long-run aggregate supply curve to this new one, right? Moving it to the left. All right, so what that does is leads to a new long-run equilibrium. All right, also, now I'm going to insert my short-run aggregate supply curve. All right, and now I've kind of ruined my spot for a title, but that's okay. All right, so here is what we're going to look at. So this is, say, option 1. And we'll say for this one, just based on the way I've drawn this graph, let's go with a increase, right? Or just we'll say expansionary monetary policy. All right, so that is one option, right? We really only have two options for the Fed. If the Fed wants to do anything about this, they can either increase aggregate demand or decrease it, all right? So we're going to check out when we increase it first, right? I've used all of my different colors, so I guess this new aggregate demand curve will be in black, all right? But so this is expansionary, so however they do it, right? So if they're going up and they're buying bonds, right? If they are decreasing the federal funds rate or decreasing the amount of interest paid on total reserves, right? Whichever option that they pursue, right? The Fed increases aggregate demand, right? So we get a new aggregate demand curve, right? And we now have a short-run equilibrium, right? A new short-run equilibrium, right? Where our new aggregate demand curve intersects our short-run aggregate supply. So in the short run, right? In the short run, increasing, right, aggregate demand or using expansionary policy, that's going to give a short-run boost to real GDP growth. All right, we're going from this older, I guess the new solo growth rate, right? And we're getting a little boost in that period of time when prices and wages are sticky, right? And it's also leading to a higher rate of inflation, right? But in the long run, we know that consumers are going to, or really just people in the economy are going to adjust to the this new inflation rate, and we're going to move this short-run aggregate supply curve up and up until we get to a long-run equilibrium. All right. So I know there's a lot of numbers on here. There's a lot of stuff going on. It gets a little clustered. All right. But all right, really the big things we see here, right, is that, all right, long run aggregate supply, the original, we have that negative shock that decreases our solo growth rate, right? It also increases the inflation rate, right? So the Fed might want to ease some of the kind of hardships that come from a negative real shock. One way that they can do that is by increasing that aggregate demand. When they do so, right, you get a short run boost, right, to real GDP growth, right, in exchange for higher levels of inflation, right? So higher rates of inflation. And as again, as we saw, or as we've talked about, right, inflation, if it gets too high, right, has a lot of different costs, right? And so that might not be the most desirable, right, option, right? But that is one of our options, right? Expansionary monetary policy, right? Increasing real GDP growth and inflation in the short run, and then also increasing inflation in the long run, right? Because that real GDP growth rate is going to go back down to the solo growth rate. All right, so that is option one. The other option is to use contractionary policy. I'm just going to write contractionary policy instead of contractionary monetary policy to leave me more room for the graph. All right, so let's draw another one of these up here. All right, I'm actually going to draw the, well, no, we'll just do what we did last time. All right, so I'm going to take my long run aggregate supply curve, my original, all right, so our LARS naught. Then I'm also going to draw in my original aggregate demand curve. Then I'll mark my original long run equilibrium. All right, so talking about negative real shocks, so let's go ahead and put that in. So we've got our negative real shock right here, right? That decrease in the solo growth rate. And we can also add in our short run aggregate supply curve. All right, so we are in the same situation as last time after that negative real shock, right? We've got lower rates of real GDP growth. We've got higher inflation, right? And the Fed might want to do something about this to kind of ease what's going on, right? So they, in this instance, choose option 2, right? Contractionary monetary policy, right? So they're going to try to decrease the money supply and decrease the aggregate demand along with it, right? So we're going to shift our curve to the left, right? Get our new aggregate demand curve, right? And get a new equilibrium as well. All right, so in our short run equilibrium in this case, all right, we have, in the short run, we see a decrease to real GDP growth. Right, so we go from our new solo growth rate to a lower growth rate, this real GDP growth rate 2. Right, but we also have a decrease in the inflation rate. Right, so we go from pi star 1 to pi star 2. Right, so that's in the short run, but we also know that there are going to be long run effects. All right, in the long run, and I'm not actually going to draw this up here just because this is already messy enough. In the long run, right, we are going to, I'll draw this, right? Right, that where that dot is, where our new long run aggregate supply curve and our new aggregate demand curve intersect, right? We're going to get a new long run equilibrium there. Right, so our solo growth rate is going to go back up to this new solo growth rate, right? And our inflation rate is going to go down even more, right? So the odds of making this chart unreadable, right? If we were to put that there. All right, so this is our short run, this is our long run. All right, the real thing, the important thing is that the inflation rate decreases. All right, so both of these, all right, neither of these are great options, all right, and that's why we said monetary policy is not very effective in combating a negative real shock, all right, and this is where we have our dilemma. All right, we're going to summarize this real quick. All right, so with option 1, expansionary policy, all right, you are trading off, all right, or trading a short run increase in real GDP growth and in exchange for a long run increase in inflation. All right, so kind of a good thing and a bad thing. All right, people will probably appreciate this boost to the economy in the short run. All right, increasing the real GDP growth rate. That's going to gonna make the economy feel like it's getting better. All right, but in the long run, you're going to pay for it with higher rates of inflation. All right, now. Some economists might say that this is the way to go because, as John Maynard Keynes said, all right, he's the father of macroeconomics, right, said in the long run, we're all dead. So who cares about this inflation because we're going to be dead when it gets here, essentially, right? But that is the trade-off for expansionary policy, right? For contractionary policy, right, we have a short run decrease in real GDP, or real GDP growth, right, in exchange for a long run decrease in inflation. All right, so essentially we're saying, all right, so for here the good, the bad comes first in the short run, right? That decrease in real GDP growth, right? That's going to be a depressed economy, right? Not as many, businesses open, not as many job opportunities, all that kind of stuff, right? Higher rates of unemployment. so on and so forth. But, right, in the long run, you get lower rates of inflation, right, which can be a good thing because, as we know, inflation has costs, right? Inflation has costs to it. So we might want to avoid that inflation. All right, so that is the negative real shock dilemma, right? Do I want to get a short-term gain, all right, in real GDP for a long-run kind of loss in inflation? And by a loss, I mean increased inflation. It's costing me more, right? Or do I want to kind of suffer in the short run with a lower real GDP growth rate, but in the future get to take advantage of the lower inflation rates, all right? And really, that's the Fed's dilemma. So which one does the Fed prefer? Which one do they think is going to be most effective or better for the economy overall? All right, but again, neither, again, like as I've said, neither of these options are really super great, and that's why you can't really do anything about a real shock, right? So real shocks, real measures are measures that are adjusted for inflation, right? So if we have a real shock, right, changing the money supply is not going to do much, especially in the long run, right? We saw in there very much examples of the fact that money is neutral in the long run, right? Even though we would get the short run boost to real GDP or short run decrease to real GDP, at the end of the day, we still return to that solo growth rate in the long run. Right, but that is it for our negative real shock dilemma, and that's it for this chapter. All right, so I will see you guys in the next one.